And hello to everybody. Bonjour à tout le monde. I'm going to speak in English, sorry. John Jacob Thomas. I'm sure there are people here who know quite a bit about him, but for those who don't know much about him, he was a remarkable Trinidadian of the 19th century. We should all know something about him. We are excited about him here and now this year because it is exactly 150 years since the first publication of his book, Creole Grammar, which was indeed the first scholarly work about the patois of Trinidad. In fact, I think it was the first scholarly work about any Creole language anywhere. Who was John Jacob Thomas? He was born around 1840. We do not have an exact date. We think he was the son either of ex-slave parents. As you know, slavery had just been abolished, 1838, or he might have been the son of parents who were free before general emancipation in 1838. In the newspaper reports about him, he's always described as a man of unmixed or quote-unquote pure African descent. And he's also described as a person coming from humble origins, which is probably code for ex-slave parentage. Now, he got his big break, if you like, when an energetic governor of the mid-19th century, Lord Harris, there are Lord Harrises all over Trinidad, began the system of government secular primary schools. They were called the ward schools because Trinidad was divided into administrative districts called wards. Very old folks know about warden's office and so on. The ward schools were free, secular primary schools. Thomas went to one of them. We don't know which. He did very well because he was chosen to be one of the few ward school ex-students to go for teacher training. What was then called the normal school, that's an old-fashioned word for teacher training college in Port of Spain, where the Tranquility schools are now. He was chosen to do teacher training there, and again, he was a star. He did very well at the normal school. As a result, at the early age of 20, he was appointed as a primary school head teacher, and in the 1860s, between 1860 and 1867, he served as head teacher in 3 rural schools in Trinidad. Now, this is 1860s. Travel is very difficult. Transportation is hard. The roads are horrible. There are no taxis. There are no buses. There are no trains. So being a school teacher in a rural school meant you were pretty isolated. And those were the years, the 1860s, when Thomas, as a young man, really became attuned to the rural society around him. It was also the period when, through his own self-study, he was self-taught largely, he mastered many languages. We think his first language was probably English or English Creole. He mastered patois, which was the language of the majority of Trinidadians in the 1860s. He mastered French, which many people spoke and read in Trinidad at that time, and he mastered Spanish, the language which was spoken by quite a lot of Trinidadians and Venezuelan immigrants. So he was a self-taught scholar of languages. He developed that in this period of his life when he was a rural school head teacher. Now, his second great break came through the action of another energetic governor, Arthur Gordon, who instituted competitive exams for entry to the civil service. This was the English model. Previously, you'd got a job in the civil service through connections and family. Now, there were competitive exams. Thomas took the very first one in 1867. He did very well. He came first, and he was appointed to a junior civil service post in Port of Spain. Now, that was what mattered. It brought him into the capital city, the colonial capital city. And now he could enter a small group of educated and cultured Trinidadians, black, mixed race, and white. He could use the new public library that had been set up in Lord Harris's time also. He could contribute to the island's lively newspaper press. 19th century Trinidad might have been a crown colony. It was a crown colony, but it had a very lively and open newspaper press. If you don't believe me, please go to the National Archives and spend a day or two reading some of the newspapers of this period. He did contribute to the newspaper press. So generally, the move to the capital brought him in touch with Trinidad's literary and intellectual world. It was small. We're talking about a very small group, but it was lively. And this was the context in which he published his first book, Creole Grammar, in 1869. A study of the patois, which was the majority language in Trinidad at the time. Why did he write it? First, he had a scholarly interest in the language, so he was a linguist, we would say today, of the scholarly type. But he had practical reasons too. He was a teacher, and he knew that it was important for teachers throughout Trinidad to be fluent in the language that most of their pupils spoke. In the ward schools, instruction was 100% in English. One of the purposes of the ward school was to spread the English language. But he knew that the teachers had to be able to converse and understand their pupils. Secondly, he had a political purpose. He makes a point in the introduction that in the law courts of Trinidad, where patois was often spoken, the court interpreters were often quite inadequate in translating patois testimony. Probably their French was good, but they weren't good at patois. And he said that that was a bad thing for ordinary people coming into the courts, speaking in patois, and not getting a good translation. Now, this book was very important. Copies of it was published in Trinidad. It was published in Trinidad by one of the newspapers of the day. But copies found their way, I presume Thomas sent them to Britain and France, and the book was reviewed in British and French journals and newspapers. And many of these reviews were reproduced in the Trinidad papers. Reading the papers of that period, this is the early 1870s, it's clear that Thomas's success with this book was a source of great pride to the small intellectual group in Port of Spain, and particularly because he was a black man who had not enjoyed any advantages of color or connections or class, etc. And in 1870, he was appointed to a very important position, Secretary of the Board of Education and Secretary of the Council of Queen's Royal College, the government secondary school for boys. Those were prestigious posts, which put him at the heart of Trinidad's education system. Think how remarkable that is. A man, an African Trinidadian, probably of ex-slave parentage, who had never been to a secondary school, far less to a university or any tertiary institution. So in the 1870s, Thomas made a visit to England in 1873. He had met in Trinidad a man called Charles Kingsley. He was a very well-known novelist of the period. I don't know if anybody reads him today, but he was a bestseller in Victorian times. He was also a clergyman and quite a famous figure in Victorian England. Kingsley had come to Trinidad. He was a friend of Governor Gordon. Incidentally, Kingsley published a book which is still worth reading. It's called At Last, A Christmas in the West Indies. It's about Trinidad. It's about his visit. Thomas was introduced to Kingsley, and when he went to England, Kingsley acted as, I hate to say it, his sort of patron, and introduced him into scholarly circles. And again, his activities in London, where he was recognized as an important contributor to scholarship about languages, Creole languages. This was reported back home in Trinidad, and again was a source of pride to the local intellectual circle. Thomas was active. He contributed to the newspapers. If you read Trinidad newspapers of the 1870s, you will come across many articles and letters by him. He always signed his letters, so you always know when he's writing, and he founded a couple of literary reviews, so he was a very important figure in Port of Spain's intellectual literary world in the 1870s and 80s. I'll just conclude by telling you that probably his better-known book, the linguists know Creole Grammar, but his better-known book is his second book, Fraudacity. Now, that's a curious term. It was a reply to a racist and reactionary book about the West Indies, which had been published by James Anthony Froude, a well-known, again, I'm not sure if anyone reads him now, but a well-known Victorian historian and writer. This book had been published in 1888. It was full of racist views about African Trinidadians and Indian Trinidadians. It was politically reactionary. And Thomas was infuriated by the book, as were many, many other West Indians, and he decided to write a rebuttal, a defense of West Indians. And he hit upon the brilliant title, Fraudacity, West Indian Fables Explained. This book was published in 1889 in London. Sadly, by the time the book was written, Thomas was very ill. He had actually been ill for much of his adult life. He was very ill, and he died in 1889 in London, the same year that Fraudacity was published. And those of you who have not read Fraudacity, it was republished in a modern edition in 1969. Please read it. It is an absolutely remarkable book which tells you a great deal about Thomas himself, about Trinidad society, and his vision as his early expression of Pan-African vision. It's a remarkable book. So that was John Jacob Thomas. We all ought to know a great deal about him. Thanks to the late John La Rose, Trinidadian who lived in England for much of his life, there are modern editions of both Creole Grammar and Fraudacity. They're available. I urge you to read them both and learn about this remarkable man. Thank you.